Tenemos el honor de presentar nuevamente en nuestro museo al escritor John Coetzee, quien va a dictar una conferencia inspirada en la selección de ensayos que componen Las manos de los maestros, que se publicó este mes en la editorial El Hilo de Ariadna, con traducción de la escritora Cristina Piña. John Coetzee nació en Ciudad del Cabo, Sudáfrica, vivió en Inglaterra y Estados Unidos y actualmente reside en Australia. Obtuvo el Premio Nobel de Literatura en el año 2003 y en 2 ocasiones le fue concedido el Booker Prize, el premio más prestigioso de la literatura en lengua inglesa. Su obra abarca una quincena de novelas, tales como Elizabeth Costello, Esperando a los bárbaros y Diario de un mal año, así como una importante obra ensayística. La editorial El Hilo de Ariadna lanzó en 2014 la biblioteca personal John Coetzee con una selección e introducción del autor a 12 clásicos de la literatura universal que lo han marcado en su carrera literaria, a la que se suma ahora Cartas de navegación, El buen relato y Las manos de los maestros, libros que reúnen sus ensayos de crítica literaria más fundamentales. John Coetzee dictará una conferencia y al finalizar va a dialogar con Ana Kazumi Stahl sobre algunos de los temas que ocupan estos ensayos. Voy a presentar brevemente a Ana Kazumi Stahl para luego dejarlos con ellos. Ella es narradora, traductora y doctora en literatura comparada. Se recibió en la Universidad de California, Berkeley, luego de estudiar en Boston, Alemania y la Universidad de Buenos Aires, en Argentina. Actualmente dirige el programa de la New York University en Buenos Aires y es coordinadora académica de la Cátedra Literaturas del Sur John Coetzee en la Universidad de San Martín. También, queremos recordarles que por favor apaguen sus celulares o lo pongan en modo vibrador y avisarles que el autor va a estar disponible al final de la conferencia para firmar ejemplares para aquellos que quieran hacerlo. Les agradecemos su presencia. Muchas gracias.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. I'm going to spend some time on the first essay in Las manos de los maestros, an essay called What is a Classic? And then, depending on time, I'll turn briefly to some of the individual authors that I write about in the book. I want to allow enough time for discussion of the book with Ana Kazumi Stahl. The first essay in the book takes up the question of how a novel, a poem, a piece of music, a work of art gets to be a classic. The person on whom I concentrate is not a writer, but a musician, Johann Sebastian Bach, who has been a formative influence on me since my early youth, and who has even, I would say, informed and influenced the way that I see the universe. So, from What is a Classic? One Sunday afternoon, in the summer of 1955, when I was 15 years old, I was mooning around our back garden in the suburbs of Cape Town, wondering what to do, boredom being the main problem of existence in those days, when from the house next door I heard music. As long as the music lasted, I was frozen. I dared not breathe. I was being spoken to by the music, as music had never spoken to me before. What I was listening to was a recording of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, played on the harpsichord. I learned this title only sometime later, when I had become more familiar with what at the age of 15 I knew only in a somewhat suspicious and even hostile teenage manner as classical music. The house next door had had a transient student population. The student who was playing Bach in the recording must have moved out soon afterwards or lost his or her taste for Bach, for I heard no more, though I listened intently. I do not come from a musical family. There was no musical instruction offered at the schools I went to, nor would I have taken it if it had been offered. In the colonies, classical music was sissy. I could identify Khachaturian's saber dance, the overture to Rossini's William Tell, Rimsky-Korsakov's Flight of the Bumblebee. That was the level of my knowledge. At home, we had no musical instrument, no record player. There was plenty of the blander American popular music on the radio, George Mellacrino and his Silver Strings, but it made no great impact on me. What I'm describing is middle-class musical culture of the age of Eisenhower, as it was to be found in the ex-British colonies that were rapidly becoming cultural provinces of the United States. And then the afternoon in the garden and the music of Bach, after which everything changed. A moment of revelation of the greatest significance in my life. For the first time, I was undergoing the impact of the classic. The question I put to myself, somewhat crudely, is this: is there some sense in which I can say that the spirit of Bach was speaking to me across the ages, across the seas, placing before me certain ideals? Or was what was really going on at that moment that I was symbolically electing high European culture as a route that would take me out of my class position in white South African society and ultimately out of what I must have felt to be an historical dead end? In other words, was the experience what I understood it to be, a disinterested and, in a sense, impersonal aesthetic experience? Or was it really the masked expression of a material interest? This is a question of a kind which one would be deluded to think one could answer about oneself. But that does not mean it should not be asked. And asking it means asking it properly, in terms that are as clear and as full as possible. As part of the enterprise of asking the question clearly, let me therefore ask what it might mean when I talk of being spoken to by the classic across the ages. In two senses, Bach is a classic of music. Sense one: the classic is that which is not time-bound, which retains meaning for succeeding ages, which lives on. Sense two: a proportion of Bach's music belongs to what are loosely called the classics, the part of the European musical canon that is still widely played, if not particularly often or before particularly large audiences. There is a third sense of the word classical, a sense that Bach does not satisfy. He does not belong to the revival of so-called classical values in European art, starting in the second quarter of the 18th century. Bach was not only too old-fashioned for the neoclassical movement, his intellectual affiliations and his whole musical orientation were toward a world that was in the process of passing from sight. In the popular and somewhat romanticized account of Bach, obscure enough in his own day, and particularly in his later years, dropped entirely out of public consciousness after his death and was resurrected only some 80 years later, mainly through the enthusiasm of Felix Mendelssohn. For several generations in this popular account, Bach was hardly a classic at all. Not only was he not neoclassical, but he spoke to no one across the generations. His music was not published, it was rarely played. He was part of music history. He was a name in a footnote in a book, that was all. It is this unclassical history of misunderstanding, obscurity, and silence that I wish to emphasize, since it calls into doubt facile notions of the classic as the timeless, as that which unproblematically speaks across all boundaries. Bach, the classic, was historically constituted by identifiable historical forces and within a specific historical context. Only once we have acknowledged this point are we in a position to ask the more difficult question. First, what are the limits of that historical relativization of the classic? And what, if anything, is left of the classic after the classic has been historicized that may still claim to speak across the ages? It is in this context that I ask myself the question, am I far away enough from 1955 in time and in identity to begin to understand my first relation to the classic, which is a relation to Bach, in an historical way? And what does it mean to say that I was being spoken to by a classic in 1955 when the self that is asking the questions acknowledges that the classic, to say nothing of the self, is historically constituted? If the notion of the classic as the timeless is undermined by a fully historical account of Bach reception, then is the moment in the garden undermined as well? Is being spoken to across the ages a notion that we can entertain today only in bad faith? To answer this question, to which I aspire to give the answer no, and therefore to see what can be rescued of the idea of the classic, let me return to the story of Bach. A simple question. If Bach was so obscure a composer, how did Mendelssohn know his music? If we follow closely the fortunes of Bach's music after his death, attending not to the reputation of the composer, but to actual performance, it begins to emerge that, though obscure, Bach was not quite as forgotten as we might believe. 20 years after his death, there was a circle of musicians in Berlin regularly performing his instrumental music in private as a kind of esoteric recreation. The Austrian ambassador to Prussia was for years a member of this circle, and on his departure took Bach scores back to Vienna, where he held performances of Bach in his home. Mozart was part of his circle. Mozart made his own copies and studied Bach's Art of Fugue closely. Haydn was also in the circle. Thus, a certain limited Bach tradition, which was not a Bach revival, simply because continuity with Bach's own time was never broken, existed in Berlin and branched to Vienna among professional musicians and serious amateurs, though it did not express itself in public performance. I say that contact with Bach's music continued among professional musicians and serious amateurs. This is the point where parallels between literature and music, the literary classics and the musical classics, begin to break down, and where the institutions and practice of music emerge as perhaps healthier than the institutions and practice of literature. For the musical profession has ways of keeping what it values alive that are qualitatively different from the ways in which the institutions of literature keep submerged but valued writers alive. Because becoming a musician, whether executant or creative, entails long training and apprenticeship, because the nature of the training entails repeated performance for the ears of others and minute listening and practical criticism, together with memorization, because a range of kinds of performance has become institutionalized, from playing for one's teacher to playing for one's class to varieties of public performance. For all of these reasons, it is possible to keep music alive and indeed vital within professional circles, while it is not part of public awareness, even among educated people. If there is anything that gives one confidence in the classic status of Bach, it is the testing process that he has been through within the profession. Today, every time a beginner stumbles through the first prelude of the 48, Bach is being tested again within the profession. Dare I suggest that in music, the classic is what emerges intact from this process of day-by-day testing. The criterion of testing and survival is not just a minimal pragmatic standard. It is a criterion that expresses a certain confidence in the tradition of testing, a confidence that professionals will not devote labor and attention, generation after generation, to sustaining pieces of music whose life functions have terminated. It is this confidence that enables me to return to the autobiographical moment at the heart of this lecture, and to the alternative analyses I proposed of it with a little more optimism. About my response to Bach in 1955, I asked whether it was truly a response to some inherent quality in the music, rather than a symbolic election on my part of European high culture as a way out of a historical and social dead end. By not trying to isolate some quality, some essence of the classic, held in common by works that survive the process of testing, I hope I have allowed the terms Bach the classic to emerge with a value of their own. Whether at the age of 15 I understood what I was getting into is beside the point. Bach is some kind of touchstone because he has passed the scrutiny of hundreds of thousands of intelligences before me, by hundreds of thousands of fellow human beings. That was an extract from the first essay in Las Manos, What is a Classic? I now propose to present shorter extracts from several of the more individual essays in the book. The first being on the writer Doris Lessing, and in particular on her autobiography. Alfred Taylor, Doris's father, having lost a leg during World War I, married the nurse who tended him and quit his native country, England. His wife, already in her mid-30s, gave up her career. Their first child, Doris, later Doris Lessing, was born in Persia in 1919. Following ideas about child rearing that were fashionable at the time, Emily Maud Taylor, her mother, imposed on her children a rigid schedule of feeding times and bowel movements, reproducing her own upbringing at the hands of an unloving stepmother. Doris responded with deep anger against a mother who on principle refused to feed her when she cried, who made it clear that she preferred her son to her daughter, and who chatted openly to guests about, I quote, how the little girl made her life a total misery. For years, Doris Lessing writes, I lived in a state of accusation against her. At first hot, then cold and hard. Since her mother would not love her, she turned to her father. I quote, the smell of maleness, tobacco, sweat enveloped me in safety, unquote. But there was a darker side to her father's love. The stump of his amputated leg poked out at her from his dressing gown, an obscenity with a life of its own. There was also the tickling game. Quote, when daddy captures his little daughter and her face is forced down into his lap or crotch, into the unwashed smell. His great hands go to work on my ribs, my screams, helpless, hysterical, desperate. Unquote. For years afterwards, Doris had dreams in which she struggled while brutal male faces loomed over her. I quote, I wonder how many women who submit to physical suffering at the hands of their men were taught by games, by tickling, unquote. To the confused signals that her parents sent out, Doris responded with behavior typical of the unloved child calling for love. She stole, lied, cut up her mother's clothes, set fires. She wove fantasies that the Taylors were not her real parents. At the age of 7, a frightened and miserable little girl, she was packed off to a convent boarding school where the nuns, themselves the unwanted daughters of German peasants, frightened their charges with hellfire stories. There she spent 4 wretched years. After a further stretch in an all-girls high school in Salisbury, in what is now Zimbabwe, with weekly letters from her mother reproving her for the money she was costing them, she dropped out of the education system definitively. She was 13. Of the 3 best-known women writers to emerge from southern Africa, Olive Schreiner, Nadine Gordimer, Doris Lessing, none completed high school. All were substantially self-educated. All became formidable intellectuals. This says something about the fierceness with which isolated adolescents on the margins of empire hungered for a life they felt cut off from, the life of the mind, far more fiercely than most of their metropolitan cousins. The first volume of Doris Lessing's autobiography is called Under My Skin. The title is taken from Cole Porter. I've got you under my skin. I've got you deep in the heart of me. So deep in my heart, you're really part of me. I've got you under my skin. I've tried not to give in, etc. The hidden addressee of the book, Under My Skin, the you deep in Lessing's heart, under her skin, emerges all too plausibly as her mother, dead since 1957. The first volume of the autobiography is dominated by the figure of her maternal antagonist, who had also figured, either openly or in disguise, in much of the fiction that Lessing had written during the course of her career. Despite a determined attempt to see her parents as ordinary human beings rather than as looming figures in the mind, the first volume falls into a pattern of blaming the mother. In the second volume, the mother returns and the mother-daughter quarrel is resumed. There is something depressing in the spectacle of a woman in her 70s, Doris Lessing, when she wrote the autobiography, still wrestling with an unsubjugated ghost from the past. On the other hand, there is no denying the grandeur of the spectacle when the protagonist is as mordantly honest and as passionately desirous of salvation as Doris Lessing. The third extract I want to present to you is from an essay on William Faulkner, the American novelist, and his biographers. I quote Faulkner, "Now I realize for the first time," Faulkner writing, looking back over his life from the vantage point of his mid-50s, "Now I realize for the first time what an amazing gift I had, uneducated in every formal sense, without even very literate, let alone literary companions, yet to have made the things I made. I don't know where it came from. I don't know why God or gods or whoever it was selected me to be the vessel," unquote. The disbelief that Faulkner here lays claim to is a little disingenuous. For the kind of writer he wanted to be, he had all the education, even all the book learning he needed. As for lack of educated company, he stood to gain more from garrulous oldsters with long memories than from effete littérateurs. Nevertheless, a measure of astonishment is in order. Who would have guessed that a boy of no great intellectual distinction from small-town Mississippi would grow up to be not only a famous writer, celebrated at home and abroad, but the kind of writer he in fact became, one of the most radical innovators in the annals of American fiction, a writer to whom the avant-garde of Europe and Latin America would go to school. Of formal education, Faulkner certainly had only a minimum. He dropped out of high school in his junior year and only briefly attended the University of Mississippi. His college record was undistinguished. A semester of English, grade D, 2 semesters of French and Spanish. For this explorer of the mind of the postbellum South, no courses in history. For the novelist who would weave Bergsonian time into the syntax of memory, no studies in philosophy or psychology. What the rather dreamy Billy Faulkner gave himself in place of schooling was a narrow but intense reading of fin de siècle English poetry and of 3 novelists who had given birth to fictional worlds lively and coherent enough to rival the real world: Balzac, Dickens, and Conrad. Add to this a familiarity with the Old Testament, Shakespeare, and Moby Dick, and a few years later, a quick study of what his older contemporaries T.S. Eliot and James Joyce were up to, and he was fully armed. As for materials, what he heard around him in Oxford, Mississippi, turned out to be more than enough. The epic, told and retold endlessly, of the South, a story of cruelty and injustice and hope and disappointment and victimization and resistance. In 1925, Faulkner made his first trip abroad. He spent 2 months in Paris and rather liked it. He bought a beret, grew a beard, began work on a novel, soon to be abandoned, about a painter who goes to Paris to further his art. He hung out at James Joyce's favorite cafe, where he caught a glimpse of the great man, but did not have the courage to approach him. Then, soon after his return to the United States, he sat down and wrote a 14,000-word sketch, bursting with ideas and characters which would lay the groundwork for the series of great novels of the years 1929 to 42. The manuscript contained, in embryo, Yoknapatawpha County. Finally, an extract from an essay on the Australian novelist Patrick White. Between 1939 and 1979, Patrick White published 11 big novels. In the remaining years of his life, up to his death in 1990, he produced stories, plays, and memoirs, but no fiction on the previous grand scale. His health was declining. His letters suggest that he doubted he had the staying power and perhaps the will, too, to bring off a substantial new work. To an inquiry from the Australian National Library as to his plans for the disposition of his papers, he responded as follows: "I can't let you have my papers because I don't keep any," unquote. As for his manuscripts, he said, these were routinely destroyed once the book had appeared in print. I quote, "Anything that is unfinished when I die is to be burnt." And indeed, in his will, he instructed his literary executor, his agent, Barbara Mobbs, to destroy whatever papers were left behind. Mobbs disobeyed that instruction. In the year 2006, she dispatched the surviving papers, a surprisingly large cache packed in 32 boxes, to the Australian National Library. Researchers have been busy with this nachlass ever since. What would White say of Mobbs's action if he could speak from beyond the grave? Perhaps the most notorious case of an executor countermanding the instructions of the deceased is provided by Max Brod, executor of the literary estate of his close friend Franz Kafka. Kafka, himself a trained lawyer, could not have spelled out his instructions more clearly. I quote, "Dearest Max, my last request, everything I leave behind me in the way of notebooks, manuscripts, letters, my own and other people's, sketches, and so on, is to be burned, unread, and to the last page, as well as all writings of mine or notes which either you may have or other people from whom you are to beg them in my name. Letters which are not handed over to you should at least be faithfully burned by those who have them. Yours, Franz Kafka." Had Brod done his duty, we would have neither the trial nor the castle. As a result of his betrayal, the world is not just richer, but metamorphosed, transfigured. Does the example of Brod and Kafka persuade us that literary executors, and perhaps executors in general, should be granted leeway to reinterpret instructions in the light of the general good? There is an unstated prolegomenon to Kafka's letter, as there is in most testamentary instructions of this kind. By the time I am on my deathbed and have to confront the fact that I will never be able to resume work on the fragments in my desk drawer, I will no longer be in a position to destroy them. Therefore, I see no recourse but to ask you to act on my behalf. Unable to compel you, I can only trust you to honor my request. In justifying his failure to honor this request, Brod named two grounds. The first was that Kafka's standards for permitting his handiwork to see the light of day were unnaturally high. He called them the highest of religious standards. The second was more down to earth. Though he had clearly told Kafka that he would not carry out his instructions, Kafka had not dismissed him as executor. Therefore, he reasoned, in his heart, Kafka must have known the manuscripts would not be destroyed. Now, in law, the words of a will are meant to express the full and final intention of the testator. If the will is well constructed, in accordance with the formulaic language of testamentary tradition, interpretation of the will be a fairly mechanical matter. We need nothing more than a glossary of testamentary formulas to gain unambiguous access to the intention of the testator. In the Anglo-American legal system, the tradition of interpretation based on such a glossary of verbal formulas is known as the plain meaning doctrine. The plain meaning doctrine has for a while been under siege. The essence of the critique was set forth over a century ago by the North American legal scholar John Wigmore. I quote, "The fallacy consists in assuming that there is or ever can be some one real or absolute meaning. In truth, there can only be some person's meaning, and that person whose meaning the law is seeking is the writer of the document. The unique, unquote, the unique difficulty posed by wills, one might add, is that the writer of the document, the person whose meaning the law is seeking, is, by definition, absent. The relativistic approach to meaning, expressed by Wigmore, has the upper hand in many jurisdictions today. According to this approach, our energies should be directed in the first place to grasping the anterior intentions of the testator, and only secondarily to interpreting the written expression of those intentions. A more open attitude has come to prevail toward admitting extrinsic evidence of the testator's intentions. In 1999, the American Law Institute went so far as to declare that the language of a document, such as a will, is, I quote, so colored by the circumstances surrounding its formulation that other evidence regarding the donor's intention is always relevant, unquote. Here, the American Law Institute registers a shift of emphasis not only in United States law, but in the entire legal tradition founded on English law. If the language of the testamentary document is always conditioned by and may always be supplemented by the circumstances surrounding its formulation, what circumstances can we imagine that might justify ignoring the instructions of the deceased? In the case of Brod and Kafka, aside from the circumstances adduced by Brod, namely that the testator had an unrealistic standard for publication of his work, that the testator was aware that his executor could not be relied on, there is a third and more compelling one, that the testator could have no reliable idea of the broad significance of his work. Public opinion is, I would guess, solidly behind executors like Brod and Mobbs, who refuse to carry out their testamentary instructions on the twofold grounds that they are in a better position than the deceased author to see the broad significance of the work, and that considerations of the public good should trump the expressed wishes of the deceased. What then should a writer do if he truly, finally, and absolutely wants his papers to be destroyed? In the reigning legal climate, the best answer would seem to be, do the job yourself. Furthermore, do it early, before you are physically incapable. If you delay too long, you will have to instruct someone to act on your behalf, and that person may decide that you do not truly, finally, and absolutely mean what you say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for coming. I have a few questions on Las Manos de los Maestros, Volume 1. And the first, a little long, a little broad, but I hope to put this question to you first. Can I ask you to tell us about why the book Las Manos de los Maestros is put together the way it is? The opening essay, first written for a lecture, then published in a journal before leading up the 2002 collection, Stranger Shores. And the second, here in this book, as well as the third, are broader theoretical essays from another, earlier collection still, White Writing, on the culture and letters of South Africa. But then, and for most of this book, Las Manos de los Maestros, we find a different rhythm in 10 richly varied texts that dive into individual writers and to unique circumstances and projects of theirs, like Arthur Miller's screenplay for The Misfits, or Patrick White's betrayed last wish to have his papers burned after his death. So what brings these texts, first published as separate, unique pieces, together now in this volume published here in Buenos Aires? Is there a new syntax or theme you're pursuing with this different curating of the pieces?
And I think the first thing to say is that this Las Manos, volumes 1 and 2, are not academic works. They're not works intended in the first place for specialists. They constitute a selection of essays I've written over the past many decades. Essays that I think are the best that I've written, that are at the same time not non-specialist work. The volume Cartas de Navegación, which came out last year, contained a more specialist work. In some cases, one really required a knowledge of Latin or German to know what was going on. For Las Manos, I've made a selection of, as I said, 24 or 25 essays. They're, for the most part, on individual writers, although each volume contains a broader essay. In the first one, it was the essay, What is a Classic? And the second volume, it's an essay on translation, on my experiences of translation. There's no great principle of organization, except that perhaps the first volume, which deals with South African, Australian, British, and American, North American writers, is, broadly speaking, Anglophone, while the second volume, which deals with German, French, Italian, Hungarian writers is more European. But there is no more profound system of organization than that. Sure.
So, in a collection of essays that starts with that one, What is a Classic? Is there something about the distilling capacity of the practice of critical, even skeptical reading that is driving your publications in El Hilo de Ariadna in Spanish, the personal library that you are publishing in El Hilo de Ariadna, seems related to that idea. It has delivered 10 volumes so far that bring a classic back to us again, each with an updated introductory essay. Could you talk perhaps about your concept of the classic and any possible relation to the project of your personal library?
Sure. I would want to distinguish the classic from the selection of choice, the selection of books I made for the personal library. The personal library is really a personal library. It's of works, particularly works of fiction, that have been important to me as a practitioner of the novel. Not all of these are classic works. To me, the classic is something much more complicated in the sense that it is a constituting notion in a cultural community. It's not something that one can define for oneself. One cannot decide by fiat that such and such a work will henceforth be a classic. It is a social and historical decision. So, to answer your question, the principle behind the personal library is quite different from the notion of the classical.
Your essay and these comments as well seem to discuss the classic in terms of the Western tradition, but you published an anthology called The Intimate Anthology of 51 Poets. It's a little risky to ask the question because you've just described the personal library as personal, but I'll try it anyway. Because the Intimate Anthology of 51 Poets really stretches the limit, decenters the frame of reference for that experience of the classic in the Western tradition, because the Intimate Anthology of 51 Poets delivers us to ancient, contemporary works, spans the eras, and it even interrogates oral traditions. Is it possible to find the classic in traditions far from one's origins or one's instruction?
No. But let me say a word about that word intimate. It was a word I struggled over for a long time and took what I think was good advice on. And the good advice was that intimate in English and intima in Spanish are not the same word. That an anthology can be intima without being intimate. So the anthology of poetry is really a personal anthology. I'm not a poet, but there is an enormous amount of poetry that moves me and sometimes overwhelms me, and that seems to me to be writing at its most intense, the kind that isn't often attained in fiction. So that was why I wanted to put together an anthology of poetry as part of the personal library, as a kind of tribute to the poets who have contributed so much to my verbal upbringing. On the question of whether one can identify classic works in other languages, my inclination would, as I say, be to say no. I think one has to work to be within the cultural framework of a language to be able to understand what the classics are and why they are the classics of that language. But I may be wrong. It may be that these national linguistic boundaries are in our time, in the process of disintegrating, and that there may be coming into existence works that we could call world classics, though I sort of doubt it.
One of the authors that you treat in Las Manos de los Maestros is Patrick White. And Patrick White's novel, The Solid Mandala, Las Esferas del Mandala, is recently published as part of your personal library by El Hilo de Ariadna here in Spanish. I think there was not a public presentation of the book. Could you take this opportunity to tell your Argentine readers about why you chose this work, this author, for publication here?
Well, I chose the Patrick White as I chose all the other writers in the personal library because, for personal reasons, there had been enormously strong influences on my own writing. Patrick White is now a somewhat neglected writer. One can hardly believe it. His status in Australia is certainly neglected. I can only say that I first taught Patrick White, the novel Voss, to undergraduates in the year 1974. And there were students in that class who told me that their lives had been transformed by reading Patrick White. Now, no one would say that today. So something strange has happened in the past 40 years. Something as strange has happened in what I can only call the spiritual realm. We are a different kind of person today, I think. Young people are a different kind of person from what young people were in the 1970s. The Solid Mandala is, I think, one of the two or three best books that White wrote. And it's in the broadest way, it's a book about the two opposed sides of the self, or perhaps the two opposed sides of Patrick White's self. That on the one hand, the self that is willed, ambitious, intellectual, and somewhat sterile. And on the other, the self that is a feeling self, that is intuitive, that is submissive to the reality of the world, which is, I think, the source of the creative aspect of White. White, once you begin talking about him, you realize how unfashionable even talk about White is, because White had what I can only call intimations of another world, and believed that to artists and certain other elect beings who could be found at any level in the social range, access to this other spiritual world was possible. Now, I don't know who believes such stuff nowadays, but White certainly presents it with extraordinary power.
Aside from presenting this book, Las Manos de los Maestros, in El Hilo de Ariadna, you are also in Buenos Aires at this time for a project at the Universidad Nacional de San Martín, where the rector has opened a cátedra. You have accepted to open a cátedra in your name, the Cátedra John M. Coetzee on Literatures of the South. An incredible initiative, now in its second year third cycle of classes. And the offerings of the cátedra seem kind of like Las Manos de los Maestros, some Australian texts, some African texts, the Argentine surrounding, though soft-spoken there, and all the while the North hovering. Could I ask you to talk about it a bit? What is the proposition behind your organizing these seminars? Or what has prompted you to formulate them as you have? And what have you seen emerge as you bring, this month again, Australian writers and professors to Argentine students?
Well, the cátedra has been running for a year and a half now. I'm here with my colleagues Delia Faulkner and Ivor Indick, who are presenting a course, an intensive 2-week course on Australian literature, and I'll be back in September with 2 South African or Southern African colleagues, Mia Couto and Ankie Kroch, to present a series of seminars on the literatures of Southern Africa. The idea behind the cátedra is really, or my idea is quite simple. It's to build up among students here, and particularly students at UNSAM, a group of graduate level students who are familiar, or to some extent familiar, with the literatures of other countries of the nations and countries of the South, principally Australia and Southern Africa, and might wish to pursue their researches in such a way that they bring these literatures together. And the reigning idea is that we'll do so in such a way that it is mediated between South and South rather than going through the North, as so many intellectual endeavors do nowadays. That's all.
But it's not all, because there's one more event of the cátedra this week, in fact, day after tomorrow, Friday, because as you've designed it, each cycle of classes ends with a roundtable discussion to which you invite 2 Argentine writers, this time to be Luis Chitarroni and Selva Almada, along with Ivor Indick, Delia Faulkner, and yourself, all speaking together. What are you finding in those dialogued encounters between distant points of the global South, like Australia and Argentina?
Well, these discussions are, very brief, and they take place twice a year. So I haven't, to be frank, found a great deal of content. There are no particularly novel ideas that have come out of those discussions, but they are living examples of South-South dialogue, which is what they were always intended to be.
I understand. That next one, the round table, is to be held Friday at 6:30 p.m. in the Sala Roberto Arlt at the book fair. Thank you very, very much today again.